Morning, folks, and welcome to today's story called Adnan Khashoggi and the Business of Corruption. Khashoggi has been on my radar since I was a teenager because I remember seeing photos of him in all the society magazines and on the Sunday papers of him at the best parties. This 5'4", bald Saudi businessman surrounded by the rich, the famous, and of course a bevy of beautiful women. Like back then, he was described as being one of the richest men in the world. That wasn't really true, but he was certainly one of the biggest spenders. Like he threw the biggest parties. He owned 3 jets. He built the world's most expensive yacht. But of course, behind the glamour, there was something much, much darker because he brokered billion-dollar arms deals. He sent escorts to charm world leaders and to help smooth his deals. He helped dictators stash their stolen fortunes. And as a result, he got caught up in some of the biggest scandals of the 1980s. He was a networker, a fantastic networker. He was a fixer, a man who lived on, I suppose, the thin line between business and crime, because presidents, kings, CEOs, they all needed him, and that was his ultimate protection. It's a fascinating story. Enjoy. Adnan Khashoggi, he was born in 1935 in Mecca, and from the start he was brought up in a rarefied environment because his father was the personal physician to King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia. And it was this connection that gave young Khashoggi more or less a front row seat to the kingdom's inner circle, because he grew up surrounded by princes, ministers, fixers, networkers. He was watching how power moved and who held the strings. The first opportunity he spotted when he was still a teenager, because one of his friend's fathers lived in Libya and he needed textiles. Another friend's father owned a textile factory in Egypt. So Khashoggi put the two together and pocketed a small commission. It was only a few $100s, but years later he said he remembered the rush, and I quote, he said, "That made me feel it's only by putting people together that you make money." In the early 50s, he went to college in America at California State University and then Stanford, but he never graduated. He was charming, ambitious, but above all, hungry to connect. And this is the theme that goes throughout this story. Khashoggi, this master networker. Now, his first big commercial success came in 1956 when he borrowed money from his father and bought heavy-duty trucks that had these wide, sand-friendly tyres. Then he sold them to Mohammed bin Laden, Osama bin Laden's father, who was, of course, the main building contractor for the Saudi royal family. Khashoggi earned an estimated $150,000 commission. That's about $1.8 million in today's money, a huge sum, especially for a 21-year-old. And so, flush with the cash, Khashoggi, he celebrated in style because Khashoggi, as we shall see, he knew how to party. But he also reinvested in cultivating even bigger connections, because he knew that one successful deal could snowball into many, many more. So by the early 60s, he had become a recognised power player. He was the official representative for Western firms who were looking to crack the Saudi market. Rolls-Royce, Chrysler, Fiat, Westland Helicopters. He signed exclusive sales agency deals with them all. In 1964, when King Faisal came to the throne, Saudi Arabia wanted to tighten its alliance with the United States. So defence and modernisation would have been top of their agenda. And Khashoggi, of course, being the ultimate opportunist, he seized this and he placed himself right between the Saudi Defence Ministry, which was headed by Prince Sultan, whom Khashoggi became very, very close to, and the major American aerospace companies who were, of course, eager for contracts. Now, this was very clever. At Khashoggi's urging, the Saudis commissioned a secret US study of their defence needs, and this report gave Khashoggi an extraordinary edge and insight, because he now knew what the kingdom planned to buy before almost anyone else. And with that knowledge, he rushed to sign agreements with the top US defence contractors like Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, Grumman. And he wasn't just introducing parties anymore. he was shaping the deals from both sides. So very, very clever and cunning. Associates described his style as almost effortless. Like in Magi gatherings, these were the informal royal salons where men sat cross-legged on cushions and drinking coffee. Khashoggi would quietly whisper advice to princes and generals about what to purchase. Then later he'd brief the Americans on how to pitch their contracts. So he made everyone feel like he was on their side, and he always made sure everyone got their cut, especially him, of course. So by the end of the 60s, Khashoggi, who was still in his early 30s, he was rich, he was connected, he was in demand, he maintains homes in Beirut and Riyadh. He married an English woman named Sandra Daly, who she changed her name to Soraya after converting to Islam, and he started a family. The 1970s, they were definitely Khashoggi's decade. Everything he'd set in motion during the 60s, his royal access, his American connections, his talent for being in the right room at the right time, they suddenly collided with one of the biggest financial shocks in modern history. You see, in October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out. And as a result, Arab states embargoed oil shipments, and overnight, crude prices quadrupled. Saudi Arabia's oil revenues exploded, leaving the kingdom with cash reserves that they never imagined. And with that windfall came ambition. So now the Saudis were determined to modernise their military on an even bigger scale. They had been doing it for the previous decade, but now, this put a rocket, so to speak, under their spending into military. And that surge of money and motivation, it created the perfect opening for Khashoggi and his commissions, which in the early years had been, around 2.5%. Now they were up to 15%. And these weren't small deals anymore. Like, these deals ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Between 1970 and 1975, Lockheed alone paid Khashoggi $106 million in fees. And that's just one company. Probably the biggest contract, but he was also dealing with dozens of other companies at that time. And I love this. It was the process of the deal making themselves became extravagant. They became pieces of showmanship, with Khashoggi using his wealth to great effect. Like, he'd fly American executives halfway across the world on a day's notice to meet Saudi princes. Sometimes meetings happened on one of his yachts, sometimes at his villa on the Spanish Riviera, and business blurred with pleasure. One deal might be finalised over a champagne toast at night, and another might be during a desert hunting trip. As one biographer said, he said, his whole modus operandi was to influence clients with his opulent lifestyle. And women, or to be more exact, women for hire, formed a central part of his MO. He often sent girls as gifts to men with whom he was doing business with. And so, in this regard, he was more or less a pimp. And this was borne out in what became known as the Cap d'Ali affair. This centred on Madame Mimi. I mean, I love these names. A French madame who ran a network of 300 young escorts that catered to Khashoggi and his powerful associates. That operation was eventually busted in 1984, when Madame Mimi was sentenced to 18 months in prison. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the 70s, because the stories of Khashoggi's deal-making became legendary. At one point, Khashoggi managed to host 5 heads of state at once, 3 of them kings, on his yacht, tending to each one's whims while nudging deals forward in the background. And by 1974, Khashoggi, he'd become this pop culture figure in his own right. Novelist Harold Robbins published The Pirates. It was a bestseller about a flamboyant Middle Eastern arms broker, and it was obviously based on Khashoggi. The American press dubbed him the Great Gatsby of the Middle East. He appeared in gossip columns, mingling with Elizabeth Taylor and Cary Grant. He cultivated friendships in Washington. Like, when President Nixon's daughter got married, Khashoggi surprised her with a jeweled bracelet worth $60,000. But, like, I got to point out, it wasn't all parties and simple charm. Khashoggi was 100% focused on deals. As one associate said, even at these fantastic parties, he's working, doing deals. He's thinking, who's important, who might help me with this or that. A deal is like a big hunt for him. And here's a great passage from an article that Dominic Dunn wrote on Khashoggi in Vanity Fair, and this is where he's describing Khashoggi's focus and MO when he's travelling between deals. When the pilot of one of his planes would announce that they were landing in 20 minutes and that the Chief of State was waiting on the tarmac, Khashoggi would go right on with what he was doing until the last possible second. Then he would change into either Western or Eastern garb, depending on where he was landing. In each of his private jets, he had 3 jets, were 2 wardrobes. One contained his beautifully tailored 3-piece bespoke suits from London's Savile Row in all sizes to deal with his continually fluctuating weight. In the other were white cotton robes, headdresses and black ribbed headbands, the traditional Saudi dress. As he deplaned, he would go immediately into the next deal and give that affair his full attention. He was also able to conduct several meetings at the same time, going from room to room, always zeroing in on that exact point under discussion. He constantly emphasised how important it is to understand what the other party to a deal needs and wants. So by the mid-70s, an estimated 70 to 80% of all Saudi military procurement passed through Khashoggi's hands. But of course, like with so much money flowing from US corporations into the Far East, and with a lot of it going through Khashoggi, it was bound to raise questions. And in 1975, US lawmakers, they launched a sweeping investigation into corporate bribery abroad. And suddenly, Khashoggi's business was front and centre. It was dragged into the light, like a Senate committee subpoenaed documents, and his business was front page news. Now, he wasn't charged because at the time, paying foreign agents wasn't explicitly illegal, but the scandal had consequences. In 1977, Congress passed what was called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that banned any kind of, quote, consultancy fees that had made Khashoggi rich. Now, Khashoggi was a short, 5'4", bald, round man, and that didn't let him get in the way of having a reputation as very much an international playboy. And by the mid-1970s, his English-born wife had had enough of his affairs and divorced him, moving back to England with their 5 children. She sued Khashoggi for $2.5 billion, estimating that was around half his fortune. Now, as far as I could see, I think at the height of his power, it was estimated that he was worth about $4 billion, but it's hard to ever know. However, she did end up with a settlement of $874 million, the biggest divorce settlement at that time. But it didn't seem to slow Khashoggi down at all, and his spending after that just escalated to really theatrical levels. By now he owned mansions on 4 continents. He was building what would become the world's largest and most expensive yacht, the Nabila, at a total cost of somewhere between $80 million and $100 million. It really is an amazing boat. You can look it up. It's not called the Nabila anymore, but if you Google Nabila, you'll see it. And it was also the boat that appeared in the James Bond movie, Never Say Never Again. But the centrepiece of this lavish lifestyle was a 5,000-acre hunting estate called Baraka in Marbella, Spain. And in July 1985, that's where he had his 50th birthday, and he turned it into this 5-day carnival of just excess. Like, you had 400 guests flown in, Shirley Bassey singing happy birthday. One writer called it the most coveted invitation since the coronation of Louis XIV. For another party, he hired rock legends Queen to perform, and they actually wrote a song about him called Khashoggi's Ship. Forgive the quick interruption, but I want to let you know about our subscription service. For just $1.99 a month, you get every weekly episode completely ad-free, so you can enjoy the story without any interruptions. Subscribers also unlock a library of special episodes from when Keith was still co-hosting with me, including a 3-part deep dive on Disney and a 2-parter on Guinness. They're brilliant. Now, Keith isn't part of the show anymore, but I still have a good few hour-long episodes that I recorded with him, and they're going to be released on the 1st of every month over the next few months. Again, for subscribers only. All of that for just $1.99 a month. If you'd like to join, it's really simple. On Spotify, just tap on the little lock symbol next to the bonus episodes in the feed. On Apple Podcasts, click on the show and you'll see the option to subscribe. Or if you prefer Patreon, head to patreon.com/Great Business Stories. There's also a link in the About section at the top of the podcast page to the Patreon page. And of course, if subscribing isn't for you right now, That's grand. Following the show and telling a friend about it is a huge help. Alright, back to the story. So he was at this stage one of the most famous and in a way celebrated business people at that time. And by this stage, it was also estimated that he was spending about $250,000 a day just to fund this lavish lifestyle. And despite some headlines naming him as the richest man in the world, he wasn't. But he cultivated that myth relentlessly. Or, in the words of Dominic Dunn from that same article, the power of great wealth is awesome. If you have enough money, you can bamboozle anyone. Even if you can create the illusion that you have enough money, you can bamboozle anyone, as Khashoggi did over and over again. Now, I also have to note that it was around this time in the mid-80s that a certain Jeffrey Epstein apparently worked as a financial advisor for Khashoggi. Now, I'm saying apparently because while their association has been widely reported in loads of blogs and videos by people who have gone down the whole Epstein rabbit hole, I couldn't find any photo of them together or any mention of their association in what I would consider credible reports. But it's out there, so I thought I should mention it, but I'm a bit sceptical of its veracity. So, it's fair to say that Khashoggi he had an amazing run for about 20 years, but then in 1985, just after his 50th birthday, came the Iran-Contra affair. Now, for some context, this was perhaps the biggest political scandal of the 1980s in the USA, because the US government needed a way to secretly supply arms to Iran in exchange for help in freeing American hostages in Lebanon. And this wasn't the sole reason. The money made from the sale of these arms would also secretly go to fund the Contras, a rebel group in Nicaragua fighting the leftist Sandinista government. As you'd expect, Khashoggi inserted himself into the middle of this whole affair, with, of course, the Saudi and the United States backing. But of course, look, it was all very, very hush-hush. That is, until October the 5th, 1986, when a cargo plane ferrying US weapons to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua was shot down by Sandinista forces, and an American crewman was captured alive, the cover was blown, and suddenly Washington was facing questions about their whole secret weapons program. By November, the whole affair had burst into public view. Journalists exposed the clandestine arms sales and the diversion of profits to fund the Contras. Televised hearings followed, and front and centre in the reports was our friend Khashoggi. Now, he scrambled to control the narratives. In December 1986, he appeared on NBC's Today Show, and he insisted he'd taken no profit. He cast himself as a patriot who was just helping the US government in a time of need. Few believed him. However, the facts of the case do show that he did provide bridging loans for the scheme and was left out of pocket. But that wasn't the plan, of course. The plan was that he would have profited from it. Now, in my opinion, there's no scandal in Khashoggi being embroiled in the Iran-Contra affair. He was an arms dealer. That's how he made his money. Like, Khashoggi was simply doing what he had always done. So I don't see any scandal in his involvement in this. The real scandal here is the antics of the Reagan administration. But of course, Reagan's head was never going to roll for this, so they needed scapegoats, like Khashoggi, like Oliver North. And again, I'm not saying that these guys were innocent. They weren't. But as always, the real culprits, those in power, they didn't face the music. Now, Khashoggi's infamy at this stage was such that he appeared on the cover of Time magazine. And again, for younger listeners, back in the 80s, getting on the cover of Time magazine, like, that rubber stamped either your fame or your infamy. And the headline beside his photo on the cover was, "Those shadowy arm dealers." And the irony here is that Khashoggi always hated being referred to as an arms dealer. And the fallout from all this was swift. Like, his credibility collapsed, and crucially, his political safety net, it just vanished, because for years the Saudi royal family had tolerated his antics because he delivered results. But by 1987, he was a liability. Now, he was never indicted for the Iran-Contra affair. I'm guessing probably because he knew too much, and the last thing the Saudis or the US government wanted was Khashoggi on the stand. But while all this was going on, Khashoggi's finances started to unravel. And because this is another part about him, Like, while he was a brilliant networker, a fantastic middleman who was able to insert himself into all these big deals and make a lot of money from them, he most definitely wasn't a good businessman in the broader sense of the word. Like, in an article on him in the New York Times, the journalist described Khashoggi as a bit like a real estate broker who thought he was a brilliant businessman because he grew rich during the real estate bubble, only to lose it all after the crash. And I agree with that assessment, because in my books, a good business person isn't necessarily someone who can make a lot of money. There's lots of people out there from all walks of life who can use their unique skills to make money. Sports stars, entertainers, influencers, real estate developers, you name it, or in Khashoggi's case, an excellent networker. But simply making money doesn't mean you're a great business person. A great business person uses the money that they make to create even much greater wealth, consistently, with good investments, with good businesses. Whereas Khashoggi, he was a disaster when it came to managing his own money. He squandered it. Like 2 weeks after that Time magazine cover, Khashoggi's holding company in the United States filed for bankruptcy, listing liabilities of $197 million and assets of just $9.5 million. That company was involved in a $1 billion investment in Salt Lake City, and only about a third of development was actually completed before it shut down. Other investments he had included banks, a chain of steakhouses on the west coast of the US, cattle ranches in North and South America, resort developments in Fiji and Egypt, a chain of hotels in Australia, and various real estate, insurance and shipping concerns, and none of them were good investments. He was a bad businessman. And while his finances were unravelling and pressure was mounting as the Iran-Contra affair raged on in Washington, Khashoggi was drawn into another huge and very, very public scandal, because investigators in the Philippines uncovered his role in helping Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos hide their fortune after fleeing Manila. And for the uninitiated, Ferdinand Marcos was president of the Philippines from 1965 to 1986. And on top of really atrocious human rights abuses, he and his wife Imelda are believed to have siphoned off between $5 to $10 billion from the state coffers into their own private bank accounts. And as their reign came to an end, Khashoggi acted as their frontman, disguising their ownership of luxury New York real estate and even storing the Marcos' stolen art. In April 1987, French police stormed his penthouse in Cannes, hunting for missing masterpieces from the Philippine National Museum, and 9 paintings were seized on the spot. And as US prosecutors built cases around both Iran-Contra and the Marcos scandal, the unravelling of Khashoggi's financial affairs were captured in one very, very stark moment for poor Khashoggi. It was the sale of his beloved super yacht, Nabila. Now, this was the ultimate symbol of his power, and now it had to be sold to cover his debts. It was initially sold to the Sultan of Brunei, who then sold it to none other than Donald Trump for just $29 million. Trump renamed it the Trump Princess, and he bragged about snapping it up at a discount and how he got such a great deal. However, listeners might probably know that I love a bit of schadenfreude, and we get some here because after spending nearly $10 million on redecorating it, Trump himself had to sell it in 1991 for just $20 million, when he also got into financial difficulty during the first of his many bankruptcies, when his Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City filed for Chapter 11. Now, interestingly, the new buyer and the current owner of this yacht is Prince Al Walid bin Talal, a very, very interesting investor. For example, this guy bought 5% of Apple way back in 1997. He was also one of the biggest investors during the dot-com bubble. I'm definitely going to do an episode on this guy at some stage. Anyway, back to Khashoggi. By the end of 1987, his transformation was complete. Once celebrated as the great Gatsby of the Middle East, he was now being hounded by creditors, investigators, headlines that chronicled his fall, and the fixer who once could host kings on his yacht, he now faced the real possibility of prison for the Marcos scandal. In October 1988, a US grand jury indicted Khashoggi for racketeering and fraud related to that case, because the charge was that he had secretly helped Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos smuggle hundreds of millions of dollars out of the Philippines, concealing their stolen assets in Manhattan skyscrapers and in priceless art. And then the end of sorts came in April 1989. Khashoggi flew into Switzerland, arriving in style, of course. Private jet to Zurich, helicopter to Bern, checked into a plush hotel called Hotel Schweizerhof. When the Swiss police arrived to arrest him, this is based on the indictment from the US, Khashoggi, he stayed calm. He asked if he could remain under house arrest in the 5-star hotel. They said no. He then requested not to be handcuffed. Again, they said no. He was let out in cuffs and put into a Swiss jail where he stayed for 4 months, and then he was extradited to the United States. The judge in the US set bail at $10 million, and Khashoggi's brothers paid it immediately. And during his trial, financial disclosures listed a net worth of just $54 million, most of it tied up in real estate that was already under foreclosure. And he had $88 million in debts. Now, of the trial itself, I won't get into the nitty-gritty of it, but while the evidence was sensational, a lot of it was largely circumstantial. And as a result, the jury came back with a not guilty verdict. And outside the court, Khashoggi told reporters that he was heading to Mecca to give his thanks. So we're into 1989 now, and of course the fall of the Berlin Wall. We have the end of the Cold War. And as a result, a new breed of arms dealer, they started to emerge. You've got the likes of Victor Baus. Sarkis Soanalian of Albanian descent became a huge dealer. So Khashoggi, he was no longer a player. And throughout the early 90s, he sold almost everything. The duplex on Fifth Avenue, this was his famous, I think, 30,000 square foot apartment. It had actually been 16 apartments that were knocked into one. His villas in Spain and France, his Marbella estate was sold, his beloved jets. But Khashoggi continues to chase deals. But maybe it's better to call them scams, because this is really what Khashoggi had become now. A bit of a con man. For example, in 1995, Khashoggi and a rogue banker arranged a $77 million loan from a Thai bank. There was no collateral, no realistic repayments. The cash went into investments that quickly soured. And when Thailand's financial system collapsed during the Asian crisis, the scam came to light. By March 1997, the authorities issued an arrest warrant for Khashoggi on charges of conspiring to defraud the bank. Khashoggi maintained that he was a victim of fraud himself, and he never went back to face the charges. By the late 1990s, money was pouring into the dot-com bubble, and Khashoggi partnered with a young protege and became involved with this company called Genesis Intermedia. It was a Californian marketing firm that rode the dot-com hysteria between 1999 and 2001. And the two of them arranged $130 million in loans using the inflated share price as collateral. And of course, then the crash happened, it all collapsed, and Khashoggi was accused of orchestrating what was really just a grubby pump and dump scheme. Now, he denied everything, but then he quietly settled. There was no admission of guilt, but there was a ban from serving as an officer or a director of any public company. A $40 million judgment was entered against him, but it remained unpaid. So, the one-time king of the arms business, one of the most visible international business figures, he was reduced to these grubby scams. It was a big come down. And by the 2010s, time was catching up with him. He lived between Monaco, London, Saudi Arabia, still surrounded by AIDS, still living a pretty good lifestyle, but far quieter. And his health had declined. He had Parkinson's. In one of his last interviews, he reflected on his life with what I suppose you'd call a characteristic bravado. He said, "I regret nothing. I did what I did because I believed in it. History will judge if I was right or not." On June 6, 2017, Khashoggi died in London at the age of 81. And it's tempting to look at Khashoggi's life through the prism of the glamour that came with the rise of the jet set crowd in the 1970s and 1980s. And I gotta admit, when I was a teenager and I was reading about Khashoggi's wealth and his lifestyle, I saw through that prism. The money was flowing, the parties were amazing, and Khashoggi was at the centre of it all. What a time to live in. You know, I mean, who wouldn't want to be in that in that rarefied circle. But I'm a bit older now, and when I scratch the surface and look at how Khashoggi earned his money, I see bribes, embezzlement, prostitution. And look, I know from all of my research that the people who were friends with Khashoggi will tell you how generous and charming he was, how he was such a great friend. That could all be true, but the fact of the matter is that Khashoggi was no more than a high-flying criminal. The only reason he was never brought to trial for most of his crimes is because his clients were the real power brokers, presidents, kings. And I was conflicted on this story. Like, is this really a business story or a crime story? It turns out that it's a business story, a crime story, and a political story. It's one that shows how money, power, and corruption are often inseparable. And that's why it makes for a great business story. I hope you've enjoyed as much as I have. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks. No. It's tempting to look at Khashoggi's life, through the prism of the glamour that came with the rise of the jet set in the 1970s and 1980s. And like, I gotta admit, when I was a teenager and was reading about Khashoggi's wealth and lifestyle, I saw it through that prism. The money was flowing, the parties were amazing, and Khashoggi was at the centre of it all. What a time to live in. I mean, yeah, who wouldn't want to be in that rarefied circle? But I'm a bit older now, and when I scratch the surface and look at how Khashoggi earned his money, like, I see bribes, embezzlement, like prostitution. And look, I know from all the research that I did that the people who were friends with Khashoggi will tell you how generous and charming he was, how he was such a great friend. That could all be true. But the fact of the matter is that Khashoggi, he was no more than a high-flying criminal. The only reason he was never brought to trial for most of his crimes is because his clients were the real power brokers, the presidents, the kings. And I was a bit conflicted when I was starting this story. Is it really a business story, or is it a crime story? It turns out that it's a business, crime, and political story. It's one that shows how money, power, and corruption are often inseparable. And that's why it makes for such a great business story. And this brings us to our listener emails, and I have one from Seb. And Seb writes, I just listened to the Red Bull episode, loved it, but why didn't you include anything about Red Bull Media House? This is such a huge and integral part of the Red Bull story. You're 100% right, Seb. I did have it in my initial research. I had it in there right up until the end, but I tried to keep each episode around the 30 to 35 minute mark. I don't want to go over 35 minutes. So I cut stuff out, and that was one of the bits that I cut. On reflection, I probably should have cut something else. So I really do appreciate that feedback, Seb. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.